In this comic book is a love story, a boy and girl in love. They get married, and after an offensively lurid description, illustrated, of course, of the couple's wedding night, the book shows how the bride murders her husband by chopping his head off with an axe. This comic book describes a sexual aberration so shocking that I couldn't mention even the scientific term on television. I think there ought to be a law against them. Tonight I'm going to show you why.
Alright, so if you're like me at all, part of you died a little when those comics burned. But I didn't do it just because I'm a jerk who likes to set things on fire. I did it because I want you to feel what people felt in the 40s and 50s when hundreds of thousands of comic books burned in bonfires across the country. It was a time when people were scared silly about comic books. They believed they brainwashed kids into becoming violent, sexually deviant criminals. Seriously, this was a widespread belief, not an obscure conspiracy theory. And a Gallup poll from that time actually showed that 70% of adults believed that comic books caused juvenile delinquency. And I know that sounds unbelievable now that comic book movies consistently dominate the box office, and characters like Ant-Man and Martian Manhunter are household names. Maybe not Martian Manhunter, but this was a serious issue for years, reported on in major media outlets, like Time Magazine's classic 1945 article, "Are comic books fascist?" No joke, that was a real thing, look that up. And it wasn't all talk either. There were over 100 acts of legislation introduced to limit the sale of comics and ban them altogether. And in 1954, there were public televised Senate hearings to discuss the effects of comic books on juvenile delinquency. But before we get into how crazy it is that actual elected senators debated the merits of comic books on TV, let me give you a brief history of comics so we can understand how things got so out of control. The first true comic book appeared in 1935 with New Fun number 1. Sure, there have been collections of reprinted comic strips before, with a handful of new stories in them, but New Fun was the first comic book with nothing but completely original material, and also the first book published by National Allied Publications, which would later become a little company called DC Comics. Just 2 years later, in 1937, there were 150 comic book titles. The comic book industry had expanded dramatically, revealing that this new American art form had struck a serious chord. Then in 1938, you have Action Comics number 1 and the debut of Superman, who became wildly popular and sparked an explosion of new superheroes, dozens of new costume crime fighters intended to capitalize on this brand new, clearly lucrative superhero idea. By 1941, 7 to 10 million comics were sold per month, with an annual gross revenue of $8 to $12 million. Flash forward to 1948 and they're selling 80 to 100 million comics every month with an annual revenue of $72 million. And that's $72 million when they're selling these things for 5 and 10 cents a pop. Just to give you some perspective, in 2017, 89 million comics were sold. In the entire year. In 1948, comic books were big business. At the same time, after World War II, superheroes became less popular, and a new genre called crime comics took over the stands. The first crime comic, Crime Does Not Pay number 22, came out in 1942 and sold about 200,000 copies per month. Not the hugest numbers at the time, actually kind of small compared to a book like Superman, for example, but its circulation steadily grew, and by 1947, every issue sold roughly 1 million copies. They were so brazen that they slapped a banner on the cover reading, "More than 5 million readers monthly," rightly assuming that kids were trading the books with each other multiple times, which vastly increased its readership. By 1952, Crime Does Not Pay was selling 2.7 million copies a month, and you have to remember, there was a multitude of other crime comics, not just this one series. These were dark, twisted books, and I have to admit, they probably weren't the best thing for kids to be reading. And as crime comics boomed, horror comics were born. 1948 saw the release of Adventures into the Unknown, the first ongoing horror title, but it was really EC Comics that drove horror to the forefront. When Bill Gaines, remember that name, it'll be important later, he took over EC after his father died, he released a whole line of horror comics. He later claimed sole credit for starting the genre.
He put out The Haunt of Fear, The Vault of Horror, Shock Suspense Stories, and Tales from the Crypt. By 1952, 1/3 of all comics were horror titles. That's about 150 horror titles on the stands. Horror was huge, and some of the greatest artists and writers in comic book history were churning out legitimately gruesome and frightening stories. 4-color fever dreams for 10 cents a piece. Now, sales statistics from this time are tough to nail down, but the Senate report on comic books, yeah, there was a time when the Senate was spending tax money researching this stuff. It says that in 1953, there were nearly 650 comic book titles, earning $90 million a year. Adjusted for inflation, that's $835 million in 2018 money, and the report makes it clear that it's being extremely conservative with these estimates. These numbers are lowballing the real figures. The actual numbers are almost certainly much higher.
From just one original comic book in 1935, less than 20 years later, the comic book business had grown into a beast of an industry, shipping hundreds of millions of copies to newsstands across the country every single month. This was the golden age of comic books. But like every good party, every golden age has to end eventually. And when the neighbors are calling the cops and there's vomit somehow inside of your PS4, it's usually not as fun as the height of the party.
In 1948, Collier's magazine published an interview with Dr. Frederick Wortham titled Horror in the Nursery. Of course, there had been criticisms of comics before, but this article was notable because Wortham was a serious, respected psychologist and academic, and this was his first foray into publicly condemning comic books in the beginning of his tireless, lifelong crusade against them. In the article, he doesn't hold anything back. He says, "The comic books, in intent and effect, are demoralizing the morals of youth." Demoralizing the morals? Anyway, they are sexually aggressive in an abnormal way. They make violence alluring and cruelty heroic. They are not educational, but stultifying. Listen to that line, in intent and effect. He's saying here, almost explicitly, that the intent of comic book artists and writers was to demoralize the youth. That's a serious charge. He goes on, if those responsible refuse to clean up the comic book market, and to all appearances most of them do, the time has come to legislate these books off the newsstands and out of the candy stores. So here he is, straight up demanding legislation against comic books. And he's not just satisfied with fighting bad comics, he goes even further. He says, even if the tiny percentage of so-called good comic books could be used, that hardly justifies the existence of comic books per se. It's rather like saying that brothels justify themselves since they relieve the housing shortage by providing a few people with a place to sleep. Listen to this guy, he's unbelievable.
You almost have to hand it to him though. Wortham didn't become popular for no reason. He had a real, unshakable confidence in his beliefs, and an innate ability to use charged comparisons to get people fired up about the evils of comic books, and people did get fired up.
After the Collier's article came out, the comic book burning started. The first documented one was in 1948 in Spencer, West Virginia. An elementary school burned thousands of comics. The Associated Press ran the story, which spread it to dozens of other newspapers like wildfire, which caused more burnings, like in Binghamton, New York, where there was a house-to-house collection of comic books and a bonfire of over 2,000 of them. Time magazine ran an article about this one, again inspiring other burnings. The anti-comics hysteria was growing out of control.
In 1948, the same year as Wortham's first interview about comics, nearly 50 cities and towns had banned certain comic book titles. Police around the country were seizing them and making it illegal to sell dozens of different series. For example, in LA, they outlawed the sale of crime comics to minors with a $500 fine or 6 months in jail. It was quickly becoming an actual crime to sell a comic book called Crime Does Not Pay.
Finally, the anti-comics hysteria came to a head in what is arguably the single most influential moment in the history of comic books. In April 1954, the Senate Subcommittee on Juvenile Delinquency held public, televised hearings to determine the effects of crime and horror comic books on juvenile delinquency. There were several people that spoke to the committee, but there were two testimonies that stand out. The first one, of course, was Dr. Frederick Wortham, and something important to mention is that he didn't restrain himself to just crime and horror comics like everybody else. Wortham makes a particular point of attacking superhero comics, lumping them in with crime comics. I couldn't find video footage of the hearings, but I've got the audio. Here's the good doctor at work.
Now, nobody versed in any of this type of clinical research would claim that comic books alone are the cause of juvenile delinquency. Is this all right?
Oh, yes, Doctor.
It is my opinion, without any reasonable doubt and without any reservation, that comic books are an important contributing factor in many cases of juvenile delinquency. If it were my task, Mr. Chairman, to teach children delinquency, to tell them how to rape and seduce girls, how to hurt people, how to break into stores, how to cheat, how to forge, how to do any known crime, if it were my task to teach that, I would have to invent the crime comic book industry. I would like to point out to you one other crime comic book which we have found to be particularly injurious to the ethical development of children, and those are the Superman comic books. They arouse in children fantasies of sadistic joy in seeing other people punished over and over again, while you yourself remain immune. We call it the Superman complex. And in these comic books, the crime is always real, and the Superman triumph of good, and every child knows that, is unreal. Moreover, these books, like many others, I don't want to single out any of them, they teach complete contempt for the police.
Would you liken this situation you talked about of showing the same thing over and over again until they finally believed it to what we heard about during the last war, Hitler's theory of telling a story over and over again until
the big lie.
The big lie.
Yeah, well, I hate to say that, Senator, but I think Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry.
And these are just the highlights. He answers questions from these senators for like over 45 minutes. And he blames comics for everything, from very real, very specific violent attacks in schools to rising teen pregnancy stats. This is a respected psychologist with a long list of accomplishments. You better believe he recounts his whole resume in great detail for these senators, not to mention getting in a quick plug for his book. Wortham is not seen by these politicians as some kind of fringe weirdo spouting off conspiracy theories. He's legit, and they treat him that way. So when a guy like this says that Hitler was a beginner compared to the comic book industry, I know it sounds crazy to us, but back then, people took him pretty seriously.
So remember that publisher of EC Comics I mentioned earlier, Bill Gaines? Now he takes a stand, and Gaines already sat through Wortham's ridiculous testimony and actually confronted him in the lobby. And on top of all that, by the way, this is not rumor or speculation, Gaines himself admits this, the guy is all hopped up on Dexedrine, an amphetamine that had him itching to defend comics, to give the performance of a lifetime for these senators and the TV cameras. It was a performance that almost killed comic books in their infancy.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wortham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
So Gaines started off strong, blasted on Dexedrine and ready to go, but then he starts to crash hard. He starts getting tired and sloppy, first saying that comic books can't possibly affect the minds of children, then later he says that EC deliberately used them to make a case against racial prejudice and send other positive messages. So which is it? Can comics affect children, or can't they? And these senators, who are seasoned lawyers and politicians, start battering him with hard questions that are designed to trip him up. They eventually get him to flat out admit that there's no limit to what he would publish, except his own definition of good taste.
And that admission led directly to an exchange that changed the comic book industry forever.
I've just been looking over some of these. Here seems to be your May 22nd issue, and here seems to be a man with a bloody axe holding a woman's head up, which has been severed from her body. You think that's in good taste?
Yes, sir, I do. For the cover of a horror comic. A cover in bad taste, for example, might be defined as holding the head a little higher so that the neck could be seen dripping from it, and moving the body over a little further so that the neck of the body could be seen to be bloody.
Well, you've got blood coming out of her mouth, you see.
A little.
Then here's blood on the axe, the hatchet. And I think most adults are shocked by that. And here's another one.
Another one. I want you to show him that one.
This is the July one. Seems to be a man with a woman in the boat, and he's choking her to death here.
With a crowbar.
With a crowbar. Is that in good taste, you think?
I think so.
How could it be worse?
This was a devastating moment. You can actually hear people in the room laughing at Bill Gaines. Newspapers around the country reported on this, and it's hard to imagine anything more damning for comics than one of its most successful publishers and impassioned defenders admitting that his only limits are his own good taste. And his good taste includes a woman's decapitated, bleeding head right on the cover.
A few days after the hearings, Wortham's book, Seduction of the Innocent, came out. It was a minor bestseller, devoted completely to exposing the harmful effects of comic books on children. It was the culmination of Wortham's anti-comics work, and he leaves it all out on the page. He accuses Superman of embodying Nazi ideals, says that Batman and Robin cause homosexuality, and details cases of seriously troubled adolescents that he worked with, linking comic books and their influence directly to their complex problems. The author's note specifically says, "Only the comic book characters in this book are fictitious. All the others are real."
But in 2013, it actually came out that Wortham fabricated and misrepresented his research. He mixed and matched quotes taken from different kids. He wildly exaggerated the number of kids he worked with from hundreds to many thousands. And in at least one case, he completely made up an example of a boy's nightmares about Blue Beetle of all things. Which is weird because, I mean, most of my nightmares involve Blue Beetle. But usually he has the face of my mother and he's telling me to clean my room. But it's totally normal though. I mean, that is totally normal though, right?
Anyway, it didn't matter that Wortham's research was phony. The damage was done. All of this anti-comics hysteria led to the creation of the Comics Code Authority, a set of rules for what material could be published in comic books. Most of the major publishers chained themselves to this code, and it endured for over 50 years until it was completely abandoned in 2011. You've probably seen its famous stamp, approved by the Comics Code Authority. In the excellent book, The 10-Cent Plague, which I recommend if you want to know more about all this stuff, David Hadju calls the Comics Code an unprecedented and never surpassed monument of self-imposed repression and prudery.
In 1952, there were nearly 650 comic book titles on the stands. After the Senate hearings, Wortham's Seduction of the Innocent, and the introduction of the Comics Code, there were 250. More than half the comics disappeared, and over 800 people lost their jobs. A thriving industry, pumping out hundreds of millions of comic books a month, was cut in half in just a couple of years. Despite the new Comics Code, there was still more anti-comics legislation, and still even more comic book burnings, with this one group, the American Legion Auxiliary, claiming that they burned hundreds of thousands of them. Imagine all those comic books going up in flames. Today they would be worth many millions if they hadn't been burned like something out of a badly written parody of Fahrenheit 451. And Timely Comics, which in 1952 was the most successful publisher, putting out roughly 60 titles a month, lost their distributor. And in a funny twist, this is the same distributor that handled Collier's, the magazine that started all of this with Wortham's first interview. Timely, which at this point had actually become Atlas, went from 60 titles a month to 8 to 12, limited artificially by their competitor National, who now handled their distribution. What was once the most dominant comic book company was caged by both its own competition and the Comics Code. When the code was adopted and more than 800 people lost their jobs, it really seemed like the comic book industry was dead. The strict rules of the code, the same rules that forbid showing law enforcement in a negative light and demanded that good always triumph over evil, it just wiped out so many different types of stories that couldn't be told with this level of censorship. Imagine if the same rules applied to books and movies. Many of the greatest works of art of the 20th century never would have happened. But there was one type of story that fit the code like a glove. The same type of story that Frederick Wortham hated just as much as the crime and horror comics which the code was practically designed to destroy. The comics code was perfect for superhero stories.
And Timely, which had become Atlas, eventually became Marvel, and Wortham's entire crusade to destroy comics, and in particular superhero comics, ultimately led to a rebirth and renaissance of superheroes as they flourished under the limits of the repressive comics code. All of Wortham's obsession with taking down superheroes resulted in superheroes becoming synonymous with comic books.
To understand the state of comics today, you have to know about this period in American history when the entire industry was nearly wiped out by paranoia and delusion about comic books causing juvenile delinquency. And in just a couple of short years, comic books changed from one of the most popular and cheapest forms of entertainment to a dirty word, a poison for the mind that caused children to become violent criminals. And if this period of anti-comics hysteria had gone down differently, maybe comics wouldn't have had such a negative stigma for the past half a century that's only now beginning to wear off.
Or this new American art form might have burned out altogether.